history is not the past. It is only what the past left behind and what later hands chose to keep. Across North America, that record runs deep. Long before European ships reached these shores, the continent held cities, roads, and monuments built by people who left no written language. What they left instead were the things themselves: mounds of earth, walls of stone, marks cut into rock. For more than a century, researchers have measured and mapped these places, dated their materials, and read the ground one layer at a time. Much has come into focus, yet some questions have refused to close. Near present-day St. Louis stood a city larger than London of the same age, then emptied within a few generations. In the deserts of the Southwest, straight roads run for miles across open land, aligned to the movement of the moon. Whole communities left cliff homes carved into stone and walked away, some leaving meals unfinished. On an Ohio hilltop, a serpent a quarter-mile long coils across the grass, its purpose still argued over, and on rock faces from coast to coast, figures wait in patterns no living person can read. None of this is unknowable in principle. Each site holds evidence, and each year adds a little more. But evidence and answers are not the same thing. The people who built these places understood them completely. We are working backward with fragments. What follows is a journey into those fragments, the places that endure, the records that survive, and the questions that have outlasted every attempt to settle them. From a certain angle, at the right hour, it looks like nothing at all. A rise of grass on the Illinois floodplain, a gentle slope beneath a wide Midwestern sky. Drivers on the interstate pass it every day without turning their heads, and yet the low green hill on the horizon is not a hill. It is the largest earthen structure ever built in the Americas north of Mexico, a monument raised by hand, one basket of soil at a time, by a people who left no written name for themselves. This is Cahokia. It stands a few miles east of St. Louis, on the flat, fertile bottomland where the Missouri, the Illinois, and the Mississippi rivers draw close together. The mound at its center rises roughly 100 feet. Around it, scattered across the plain, are the remains of more than 100 others. Seen from above, they form the skeleton of something that was once far more than a settlement. 900 years ago, this was a city. Around the year 1050, something extraordinary happened on this floodplain. In the span of perhaps a single generation, a modest cluster of villages transformed into the largest urban center north of the great civilizations of Mesoamerica. Archaeologists sometimes call it the Big Bang, a sudden deliberate act of planning and construction. Neighborhoods were laid out, plazas were leveled. Thousands of people arrived, some almost certainly from distant regions, drawn to something happening here. At its height, Cahokia may have held 10 to 20,000 people. For its time and place, that was immense. It rivaled the great European cities of the same century, and it appeared, by the standards of the continent, almost overnight. Consider what that required. The central mound, known today as Monk's Mound, named for the French Trappist monks who lived nearby many centuries later, contains more than 20 million cubic feet of earth. Every particle of it was carried on human backs. There were no draft animals here, no wheels, no metal tools, only baskets and hands, and an organizing vision powerful enough to move a community to build for decades. On its summit once stood a great timber structure, a building set above the entire city, where the most powerful figures of Cahokia would have stood in full view of everyone below. The people who built all this belonged to what archaeologists call the Mississippian culture, a network of societies that spread across the American Southeast and Midwest, linked by shared beliefs, shared art, and shared ways of ordering the world. Cahokia was its greatest expression. corn agriculture fed its population. Trade goods flowed in from astonishing distances. Copper from the Great Lakes, seashells from the Gulf of Mexico, mica from the southern Appalachians. They played a game called chunky, rolling a polished stone disc across open ground while players hurled spears at where it would stop. Thousands would gather to watch. The plazas were built for crowds. They were also astronomers. On the western edge of the city, researchers uncovered the remains of enormous circles of upright wooden posts, a structure now called Woodhenge. Aligned to the rising sun at the solstices and equinoxes, it tracked the turning of the year. Standing at its center at dawn on the right day, a viewer would have watched the sun emerge directly from the flank of Monk's Mound itself, as though the city were giving birth to the light. These are the things we can see, measure, and hold. And then there is Mount 72. It is a small, unassuming ridge, easy to overlook among the larger monuments. But when archaeologists excavated it in the 1960s, they found something that has shaped every conversation about Cahokia since. At its heart lay a man, laid to rest upon a bed of more than 20,000 shell beads, arranged in the shape of a bird, a falcon, wings spread beneath and above his body. Near him were others, buried with great ceremony and clear reverence. But surrounding these central figures were other graves, mass graves. In one, more than 50 young women, close in age, buried together. In another, men who appeared to have died violently. The evidence indicates these were not ordinary deaths. Many researchers interpret them as human sacrifice, lives offered as part of the rituals that bound this society together. The falcon and the beads suggest a person of immense status. The surrounding dead suggest a society capable of demanding the ultimate price. We do not know his name. We do not know what he was called, what he ruled, or what he believed himself to be. Mainstream scholarship today reads Cahokia as a genuine city with a complex social hierarchy, a chiefdom, or perhaps something more centralized still, organized around powerful leaders, religious authority, and a shared cosmological vision. The mounds were not merely tombs or houses, they were stages. They elevated the sacred and the powerful above everyone else, quite literally raising them toward the sky. For roughly 2 centuries this system flourished, and then slowly it came apart. By around 1200, the signs of strain begin to appear. The population starts to thin. Around this time, the people of Cahokia built a massive defensive palisade, a wooden wall nearly 2 miles long, enclosing the central precinct, rebuilt several times. It is a wall meant to keep something or someone out. Its presence suggests a world that had grown less secure than the one that raised the great mounds. Neighborhoods emptied, construction slowed, then stopped. And by the year 1400, decades before any European set foot in the region, Cahokia was essentially empty. The plazas fell silent. The great city on the Mississippi had been abandoned by the very people who built it, and by their descendants after them. When French explorers arrived in the 17th century, they found the mounds. They did not find the city. The local indigenous peoples of that later era were not its builders, and the memory of who had raised these monuments had passed beyond living recollection. So the central question remains: what happened here? For much of the 20th century, a compelling explanation held sway. Cahokia, the argument went, had exhausted itself. A large population demanded enormous resources. Forests were cleared for fuel and construction. Cleared hillsides eroded. Erosion led to flooding. Flooding ruined crops and homes. In this reading, Cahokia was a story of a society that grew too large for its landscape and collapsed under its own weight. A cautionary tale, almost, for our own age. It is an elegant theory, but in recent years, parts of it have been questioned. When archaeologist Caitlin Rankin examined the sediment layers near the mounds, looking for the expected evidence of catastrophic flooding caused by deforestation, she did not find it. The soil beneath the central city remained stable across the crucial centuries. The self-inflicted ecological collapse that so many had assumed simply did not leave the mark it should have left. The land, it seems, was not destroyed by those who lived on it. If the city did not consume itself, then why did everyone leave? Several interpretations have been proposed, and researchers continue to debate them. One points to climate. Studies of the wider period suggest shifting rainfall patterns across the American Midwest, including episodes of prolonged drought. For a society built on corn, a series of failed harvests could gradually undermine everything, not in a single disaster, but in a slow erosion of confidence, of surplus, of the reasons to stay. Another looks inward, to the society itself. The Great Palisade hints at conflict. Some scholars suggest political instability, factional struggle, or a loss of faith in the leaders and the beliefs that had once held the city together. If Cahokia was bound by a shared vision, by ceremony, by the authority of those atop the mounds, then the failure of that vision could unmake it as surely as any drought. There is a broader pattern here as well. Cahokia was not the only Mississippian center to empty in these centuries. Across a vast region of the middle Mississippi Valley, settlements were abandoned in what one researcher called the vacant quarter, a great emptying that left the heart of the continent strangely quiet. Whatever unfolded at Cahokia may have been part of a larger transformation that we still do not fully understand. The available evidence does not yet allow us to choose with certainty among these possibilities. It may be that no single cause is the answer, that climate and conflict and belief and simple human decision all pressed together until leaving made more sense than staying. Return for a moment to what we know for certain. We know that people came here in great numbers and built with extraordinary purpose. We know they tracked the sun, honored their dead with beauty and with blood, and raised a monument that still stands after 1,000 years. We know that they stayed for 2 centuries, and then, deliberately, they went, dispersing across the land, carrying their stories with them, leaving the mounds behind. They did not vanish. Their descendants live today among many native nations of the continent. What ended was not a people, but a way of living together, a particular answer to the question of how thousands of human beings might share one place, one belief, one city on the river. The grass grows over the mounds now. Children climb the steps of the Great One on summer afternoons, and from its summit you can still see the towers of St. Louis across the water, a newer city facing an older one. Between them, silent, is everything we have not yet learned to read. 2 teams of scientists stood over the same mound, took samples from the same earth, and came away with answers 1,000 years apart. That is where this begins, not with the shape, but with the argument about its age. In the 1990s, researchers pulled fragments of charcoal from inside the effigy and ran them through radiocarbon dating. The result pointed to roughly the year 1070. A later study, sampling other material, pushed the date back nearly 2 millennia. Both cannot be right. And depending on which is, the builders were entirely different people, living in entirely different worlds, separated by a span longer than the distance between us and ancient Rome. The mound itself offers no opinion. It lies in Adams County in the rural southwest of Ohio, on a plateau above a creek called Brush Creek. A ridge of earth, raised only a few feet, winding across the ground in a series of coils, and at one end, jaws opening around a great oval, as though about to close on it. From the side, walking beside it, a visitor might mistake it for a low natural rise. Its true form belongs to the sky. Nearly a quarter of a mile long, it becomes a serpent only when seen from above. Which is the first strange thing about it. The people who built it labored over a figure they could never stand back and see whole. They knew what they were making. They simply did not need to see it complete to believe it mattered. Here is the second strange thing. When Frederick Ward Putnam of Harvard's Peabody Museum excavated portions of the effigy in the late 19th century, after finding it neglected and eroding, and raising the funds to save the land, he found what was not there. No burials, no human remains within the coils, no cache of tools, no ornaments, none of the material that archaeologists rely on to date a site or read its purpose. Most great earthworks of the eastern woodlands were built for the dead. This one was not. It was built to be a shape and nothing else. Consider what that rules out and what it leaves standing, not a tomb, not a granary, not a foundation. A community organized itself, moved tons of soil by hand, and produced a single enormous image on the land, for reasons that were never practical and never buried with anyone. The ground they chose is itself unusual. Geologists have identified the plateau as part of an ancient impact structure, a place where something struck the earth hundreds of millions of years ago and left the bedrock folded and fractured in ways found almost nowhere else nearby. The builders could not have known this in scientific terms, but of all the level ground in the region, they raised their serpent here, on disturbed, anomalous land. None of this settles the question of who they were. For much of the 20th century, most scholars pointed to the Adena, an early people who built burial mounds across the Ohio Valley more than 2,000 years ago. There is an Adena mound close by. The association felt natural. Then came the 1070 date, and with it a different candidate entirely, the Fort Ancient Culture, living in the same region nearly 1,000 years later. The debate has not closed. It is not a matter of one careless measurement against a careful one. It is two careful measurements that disagree. Stand with that uncertainty for a moment, because it changes how everything after it reads. If the serpent is a Fort Ancient work of the 11th century, then it was raised in a remarkable window of the sky. In 1054, a supernova blazed into view over North America, bright enough, records from other parts of the world tell us, to be seen in daylight for weeks. It left behind what we now call the Crab Nebula. And in 1066, Halley's comet crossed the heavens, trailing its long tail across the same skies. Some have wondered whether a sinuous, tail-trailing serpent, built around this time, might hold the memory of a comet. It is a genuinely interesting thought. It is also, for now, only that. No direct evidence ties the mound to any comet or exploding star. The idea is worth naming and worth setting in its proper place, a possibility, not a finding. Because there is a far stronger relationship with the sky, and it does not depend on which century you choose. The head, the great curving head, and the oval held in its open jaws point toward the place on the horizon where the sun sets on the summer solstice, the longest day of the year. This alignment is widely regarded as real and probably deliberate. Some researchers extend it further, arguing the coils of the body correspond to the winter solstice sunrise, to the equinoxes, to the year folded into a single winding form. Those wider claims are debated. The solstice head is not, or not much. So, whatever else the serpent was, it watched the sun. And serpents meant a great deal. Across many Native American cultures, the serpent carried associations with water, with the underworld, with renewal and fertility and the turning of cycles. A serpent reaching toward the setting solstice sun is not a random image. It is a statement in a language of symbol we can only partly still read. The oval in its jaws deepens the question rather than answering it. An egg, the sun, a thing being swallowed and perhaps returned. Each reading has its defenders. The shape declines to choose. At dusk in midsummer, the argument stops being academic. The head lifts toward the notch in the hills. The sun lowers into it. For a few minutes, earth and light and horizon fall into the same line, most likely, that fell into place 1,000 years ago, or 2,000, for people whose names are gone and whose reasons we can only walk toward without arriving. What survives all the uncertainty is the intention. This much is not in doubt. The serpent was not carved by erosion or thrown up by chance. Every curve was chosen. The builders read the land and, it seems, read the sky, and married the two in an image scaled to be legible only from a vantage they would never occupy. That may be the quietest thing about it. We arrive late, with our radiocarbon dates that disagree, our maps of the coils, our measured angles to the solstice sun. We assemble what the evidence allows, and we admit, honestly, where it runs out. 2 ages, 2 possible peoples, a dozen readings of a single oval, and through all of it the serpent simply lies there across its plateau, patient and exact, holding its shape in open jaws, aimed at a horizon it has watched far longer than anyone has watched it. Start with a road that goes nowhere. It runs north out of Chaco Canyon, across the high desert of northwestern New Mexico, in a line so straight it seems drawn with an instrument. It does not bend for hills. It does not curve toward water or shade or any obvious destination. Where the land rises into a mesa, the road does not go around. It climbs over, and on the far side, in some places, stairways were cut directly into the rock to carry it down the cliff face and let it continue, still straight, still north. 35 miles later, it simply ends. There is no city there, no great structure waiting at the terminus to justify the effort of reaching it. The road, called the Great North Road, was built with enormous care to arrive at a place that, by any practical measure, is empty. That is the puzzle at the heart of Chaco. Not the buildings, though the buildings are extraordinary. The roads. Before the roads, though, you have to understand what they connected, or seemed to connect. 1,000 years ago, this arid, wind-scoured canyon was the center of a world. Between roughly 850 and 1150, the ancestral Puebloan people built here on a scale unmatched anywhere in what is now the United States. They raised massive stone structures called great houses, some 4 and 5 stories tall, containing hundreds of rooms, engineered with a precision that still commands respect. The largest, Pueblo Bonito, held perhaps 600 rooms and dozens of the circular ceremonial chambers known as kivas. It stood as the tallest building in North America for centuries, until the rise of the great cities of the East, and Chaco was not a comfortable place to build a civilization. The canyon is dry, exposed, brutal in summer and bitter in winter. The soil is poor. Timber for those enormous roofs did not grow nearby. Hundreds of thousands of trees were carried in from mountain ranges dozens of miles away, without wheels, without draft animals on human shoulders. People chose to do this. They chose this canyon, and they invested generations of labor into it. Walk through Pueblo Bonito now, in the long shadows of late afternoon, and the scale of the ambition is quiet but undeniable. The walls are still standing. The doorways still frame the sky. Now, the roads again, because this is where the accepted story starts to strain. When archaeologists first mapped the network in earnest, using aerial photography and later satellite imagery, they found something that did not match their expectations. The Chaco roads are not footpaths worn into the ground by generations of walking. They were deliberately engineered, wide, often around 30 feet across, far wider than a single file of travelers would ever need, edged in places with low berms or lines of stone, and above all, straight, to a degree that natural trails never are. A trail responds to the land. It seeks the easy grade, the river crossing, the pass. It wanders because wandering is efficient. The Chaco roads do the opposite. They hold their bearing across broken country, insisting on the line even where the line is difficult, even where a curve would have been simpler and faster. Roughly 400 miles of these roadways have been identified across the region. They link Chaco to dozens of outlying great houses, smaller versions of the canyon's monuments, scattered across tens of thousands of square miles of the San Juan Basin. Seen on a map, the pattern suggests a system, a center, and lines radiating outward to a network of connected places. For a long time, that was the working interpretation, and in part, it still is. The roads were infrastructure, the arteries of a Chacan world, moving people and timber and pottery and turquoise between the center and its satellites, binding a dispersed society into something coherent. It is a reasonable reading, and much of the evidence supports it. Goods did move. Communities were connected. Chaco did function, in some sense, as a hub, but the roads keep resisting that explanation at the edges. Return to the Great North Road. If its purpose were simply to move goods between settlements, its form makes little sense. Why 30 feet wide, when a fraction of that would carry any traffic these people generated? Why insist on the straight line, at real cost in labor, when a winding path would move the same cargo more easily? And why does it run to an escarpment above a badlands and stop? Having passed the outlying communities it might have been built to serve, rather than aiming at them. The available evidence suggests these roads were not only, or even primarily, about transportation. Consider what the North Road points toward. It runs, with remarkable fidelity, true north. Not magnetic north, which drifts, but geographic north, the fixed axis of the turning sky. To lay a line that straight and that accurately toward true north, across 35 miles of uneven desert, requires sustained astronomical observation and a real command of geometry. This was not casual work. It was a statement written into the land, aligned to the heavens. And Chaco, it turns out, was saturated with such alignments. The great houses themselves are oriented to the sky. Some of their walls track the cardinal directions with striking accuracy. Others align to the sun at the solstices, or to the moon. And this brings us to the most demanding claim of all, one that took researchers decades to even recognize, because it operates on a timescale longer than a human life. The moon does not rise in the same place each month or even each year. Over a cycle of roughly 18.6 years, the points on the horizon where it rises and sets slowly swing outward to their extremes and back again, a rhythm called the lunar standstill. To notice it at all, you must watch the horizon carefully for the better part of 2 decades. To build toward it, you must have watched across generations and passed the knowledge down. Several major Chacan structures appear to be aligned to these lunar extremes. The great House of Chimney Rock, on the far eastern edge of the Chaco world, sits atop a high mesa framed by 2 natural stone pillars. At the major lunar standstill, the moon rises directly between those pillars, and the building was constructed, tree ring dating suggests, in the years when that alignment would have been visible. It appears the Chacans built there because of what the sky did over that particular horizon. If that reading holds, then some of the roads and buildings of Chaco were not aimed at other places at all. They were aimed at the sky, and at time itself, at cycles measured across decades, tracked with patience no modern society would easily muster. Stand on that northern escarpment at the end of the Great North Road, where the engineered line finally releases into open desert. There is nothing to sell you on. Just the drop into the Badlands, the wind, and the long, empty distance running true north toward the pole of the sky. So, where were the roads meant to lead? Here, the mainstream and the more speculative interpretations begin to converge on something unexpectedly profound. Many researchers now believe that at least some Chacuan roads were not routes between destinations in the ordinary sense. They may have been ceremonial, pathways with meaning in themselves, connecting the living center to the north, the direction associated in some Puebloan traditions with the place of origin and with the dead. The Great North Road, in this reading, does not fail to reach a destination. Its destination is the direction itself. North. The line toward which it points may have mattered more than any point along it. This interpretation draws support from the modern Pueblo peoples, the descendants of the Chacuans, who did not vanish and whose oral traditions remain living knowledge. Directionality, emergence, and sacred geography run deep in Puebloan thought. For the people who carry that heritage, the idea that a road might be built to honor a direction or to enact a journey of the spirit is not exotic speculation. It is close to home. And yet caution is warranted because the evidence remains incomplete. Not every road has been fully traced. Some segments once mapped from the air have proven difficult to confirm on the ground. The precise function of the network, how much was ceremonial, how much practical, how much both at once, is still genuinely debated. Researchers continue to argue over which alignments are deliberate and which are the mind's tendency to find order in scattered points. A straight line drawn across a landscape will, by chance, point at something. But the strongest evidence sits above all of that noise. The width that exceeds any practical need. The straightness maintained at real cost. The stairways cut through solid rock to preserve a bearing. The orientation to true north, and to a lunar rhythm that takes 19 years to complete. These are not accidents. Whatever the Chacans were doing, they were doing it deliberately, with knowledge accumulated across lifetimes, and with an investment of labor that only deep conviction can explain. Around 1150, the canyon began to empty. A prolonged drought settled over the region, the great construction ceased, and the center of the Chacuan world shifted elsewhere. The people moved on, to the north and west and south, to the mesas and river valleys where their descendants live still. The great houses were left to the wind. The roads were left pointing where they had always pointed. We can measure them now. We can fly above them, map their bearings, calculate their alignments to the sun and the moon and the pole. We can say, with confidence, that these were built by people who watched the sky with extraordinary attention and who shaped their world to answer it. What we cannot fully say is what it meant to them to walk that northern road. Whether it carried the living or the dead, the body or the spirit, cargo or ceremony, or, as seems increasingly likely, some braided combination of all of these that our categories are too narrow to hold. The road is still there. It still runs straight. It still ends, as it always did, at the edge of the empty land, aimed at the fixed point of the turning sky. And it is still patiently pointing north. A mug of black and white pottery, sitting on a stone ledge where someone set it down. A sandal, half woven, the fibers still crossed as they were left by the hands that were making it. Corn cobs in a storage room, a stone axe leaning in a corner. Sleeping mats. Tools resting where a day's work paused. In the cliff dwellings of Mesa Verde, in the high country of southwestern Colorado, archaeologists have found rooms that look less like ruins than like homes their occupants meant to return to, but no one returned. For 700 years the mug sat on its ledge. Let us begin not with the people who built these dwellings, but with the men who found them empty. In December of 1888, two ranchers named Richard Wetherill and Charlie Mason were searching for stray cattle across the snow-covered mesa. Through a veil of falling snow, across a canyon, they saw it. a great stone city tucked into a natural alcove in the cliff face, towers and walls and rows of rooms, silent under the winter sky. They called it Cliff Palace. It had been sitting there, abandoned, for roughly 6 centuries before their eyes fell on it. What they had stumbled into was the largest cliff dwelling in North America, and it was only one of many. To understand what they found, we have to go backward, into the long history that led to that alcove. The ancestral Puebloan people had lived in this region for more than 700 years before the cliff dwellings were ever built. For most of that time, they did not live in the cliffs at all. They lived on top of the mesa and in the open valleys, first in pit houses dug into the earth, later in villages of stone and adobe built in the sunlight, farming the mesa tops. Corn, beans, and squash. Turkeys. A settled agricultural life, generation upon generation, rooted in this high green tableland that rises above the surrounding desert. They were skilled. They were patient. They read the land and the seasons, and for centuries the arrangement held. Then, late in the 12th century and into the 13th, something changed. The people came down off the open mesa tops and into the cliffs. They began building their homes inside the natural alcoves that pocket the canyon walls, sheltered from snow and sun, but difficult to reach. Accessible only by hand and toe holds cut into sheer rock, or by ladders that could be drawn up behind them. This is the first quiet question Mesa Verde asks. Why move? For hundreds of years, these people had lived comfortably in the open. Now, within a few generations, they invested enormous labor in relocating into defensible cliffs. Cliff Palace alone holds around 150 rooms and more than 20 of the circular ceremonial chambers called kivas. Building it in that alcove, hauling stone and water and timber up and down the canyon walls, was far harder than building on flat ground. People do not take on that kind of difficulty without a reason. Stand inside one of these alcoves now, in the cool shade, and look out through the openings at the canyon beyond. There is a feeling here that is hard to name, of shelter and of watchfulness. The dwellings face outward. They command their approaches. Whatever else they were places you could defend. The cliff period was brief. That is the part that surprises people most. These famous dwellings, the images that define Mesa Verde in the world's imagination, were occupied for perhaps only 75 to 100 years. 3 or 4 generations. Roughly, the span from a great-grandparent to a great-grandchild. The people moved into the cliffs, built their remarkable stone cities, lived in them for the length of a long human memory, and then left. By around 1300, the entire region was empty. Not just Mesa Verde, but the whole of the surrounding country. Tens of thousands of people, gone from a landscape their ancestors had farmed for 7 centuries. Archaeologists sometimes call this the depopulation of the northern San Juan. It was total, and it was permanent. No one came back, and here we reach the objects on the ledges. In some rooms the departure looks orderly. Belongings stored, spaces closed up, the ordinary residue of a planned move. But in others, everyday things were left in place. Pots, tools, food, the half-finished work of daily life. The pattern is uneven, and archaeologists read it carefully rather than dramatically. People leaving deliberately still leave heavy or replaceable things behind, but the sense remains in certain rooms of lives interrupted, of a threshold crossed and not crossed back. So, what happened? Here, mainstream scholarship has, over the past few decades, assembled an answer of real substance, though not a simple one. The clearest thread is climate. The American Southwest keeps an extraordinary record of its own past, written in the rings of trees. Tree ring dating, refined over a century of work, allows researchers to reconstruct the region's rainfall year by year, deep into the past. And the record shows that in the final decades of the 13th century, a severe and prolonged drought settled over the Colorado Plateau, the event often called the Great Drought, running roughly from 1276 to 1299. For a society that lived by farming corn at high dry elevation, this was not a minor hardship. Growing seasons shortened. Harvests failed. The margin these people lived on, always thin in this demanding country, narrowed toward nothing. But the researchers are careful here, and so should we be. Drought alone does not fully explain it. These people had weathered droughts before. Earlier dry periods, some nearly as severe, had not emptied the region. Something about this convergence was different, and the current evidence suggests it was not one cause but several, pressing together at once. Consider what else was happening. The population had grown large, and the land was heavily used after centuries of farming. Soils were depleted, timber and game were under pressure. When the drought struck a landscape already stretched near its limit, the system had little left to absorb the shock. And there are signs in this same period of something darker. Archaeological evidence across the region points to increasing violence in the final decades. Defensive architecture, the retreat into those hard-to-reach cliffs, and at some sites remains that indicate conflict and bloodshed. When resources collapse and communities compete for what little remains, the social fabric can tear. The move into the cliffs may itself have been a response to a world growing more dangerous. The available evidence, then, points not to a single catastrophe, but to a braid of pressures: drought, resource depletion, social conflict, and the strain each placed on the others. That together made staying impossible. Yet even this leaves a real question unanswered, because the people did not simply die, they left. And leaving, in an organized way, across an entire region, is its own kind of decision. This is where the descendants of Mesa Verde speak, and where the most important correction to the old story lies. For a long time, popular accounts spoke of a people who vanished or disappeared, as though they had dissolved into the desert air. They did nothing of the kind. The ancestral Puebloans migrated, south and east, toward the Rio Grande Valley of New Mexico and the mesas of what is now Arizona. Their descendants are the Pueblo peoples of today, the Hopi, the Zuni, the communities along the Rio Grande. They did not disappear, they moved, and they endured, and they are here. For many of these communities, the migration is not a mystery at all. It is remembered. In Puebloan traditions, movement across the land is woven into the understanding of who the people are. Migration is part of a longer story of emergence and journey, of places that were meant to be lived in for a time and then left. Seen through that lens, the departure from Mesa Verde was not a failure or a flight. It was, in some sense, a passage that was always going to come. That perspective sits alongside the archaeological one rather than replacing it. Both can be true. A society can be pushed by drought and conflict, and also understand its own leaving as part of a meaningful pattern. The physical evidence tells us the conditions. The living traditions tell us something about the meaning. Neither, on its own, is the whole. Walk through Cliff Palace today along the paths that thread between its rooms and towers, and the two truths stand together in the stone. Here is a city built with great skill in a demanding place. Here are the marks of pressure, the defensive position, the strain of those final years. And here, too, is the quiet fact that its builders' descendants live on, a day's drive to the south, carrying the memory forward. The strongest evidence, in the end, is the least dramatic. The tree rings, recording a drought no farmer could outlast. The land itself, worn by centuries of use. The defensive walls. The migration routes traced south through the pottery and the architecture, connecting these canyons to the living pueblos. Together they describe not a disappearance, but a departure. Difficult, perhaps painful, but human, and understood by those who made it. The mug still sits on its ledge in the cool shadow of the alcove, exactly where a hand placed it more than 700 years ago. We can look at it. We can wonder about the morning it was set down, and the day the people walked out along the canyon rim and did not come back. They knew where they were going, even if we are still learning how to follow. The Hohokam Canals. The name of the city is not an accident. Phoenix, Arizona, a modern metropolis of millions, spread across a desert valley where the summer air can pass 115 degrees. It was named in the 19th century by a settler who understood exactly what he was looking at. He knew the valley had held a civilization before. He knew it had risen, flourished, and fallen. And he chose the name of the bird that is reborn from the ashes of the one before it, because the city he was founding would rise, quite literally, on the bones of another. Beneath the streets and canals of modern Phoenix lies an older network. And when the first American farmers came to this valley to dig irrigation channels for their fields, they made a discovery that saved them years of labor. The work had already been done. Ancient canals, centuries abandoned, ran exactly where the new ones needed to go. In many cases, the settlers simply cleared them out and used them again. The people who dug those canals are called the Hohokam. And the story of this valley is, at its heart, the story of water, who could command it, and what happened when they could no longer hold it. Follow one of those ancient channels from the air, and its scale becomes clear. This was not a ditch. The Hohokam built a system, hundreds of miles of main canals threading out from the Salt and Gila rivers, branching into smaller distribution channels, spreading water across tens of thousands of acres of desert. Some of the main canals ran for more than 20 miles. Some were wide enough and deep enough to swallow a modern vehicle whole. It is, by broad agreement, the largest and most sophisticated irrigation network built in the ancient Americas north of Mexico. And they built it with no metal tools, no draft animals, no wheels, no surveying instruments of the kind an engineer would recognize today. Sit with that for a moment, watching the desert light move across the excavated banks of a canal that carried water 1,000 years ago. Everything about this valley is dry and hard. The people who made it green did so by hand. To move water across a landscape this flat is a problem of extraordinary precision. Too steep a slope, and the current cuts into the canal, tearing it apart. Too shallow, and the water slows, drops its sediment, and clogs the channel with silt. The Hohokam had to thread their canals along a gradient so gentle it is nearly imperceptible to the eye, a drop of just a few feet over miles of distance, and they had to hold that gradient across the entire network. They did it, and they maintained it for more than 1,000 years. That is the first thing to understand about the Hohokam. Before we ask why they disappeared, we have to grasp what they achieved, because the achievement makes the disappearance far harder to explain. Who were they? The Hohokam emerged in the Sonoran Desert of southern and central Arizona, and by roughly the year 450, they had begun the canal building that would define them. Over the following 8 centuries, their society grew into something remarkable. They lived in substantial villages along the waterways. They built large earthen platform mounds and, at some sites, ball courts, oval sunken arenas that echo the ballgame traditions of Mesoamerica, far to the south, suggesting these desert farmers were connected to a much wider world of trade and ideas. They made fine painted pottery. They carved stone. They practiced a subtle craft the desert seems to have taught them. They etched designs into seashells, using the fermented acid of the saguaro cactus fruit, a chemical technique they were using centuries before anything comparable appears in Europe. They were not a marginal people scratching at the edge of a hostile land. They had, in every sense that matters, mastered it. For 1,000 years, the desert bloomed because they willed it to. Their society reached its height in the centuries around 1150 to 1300, a period of large, thriving communities and the fullest extent of the canal network. At Casa Grande, near the Gila River, they raised a great 4-story structure of caliche mud, its walls still standing today beneath the protective modern roof. Its upper rooms contain openings that align with the sun and the moon at significant points in their cycles, the work of people who watched the sky closely and built their observations into their architecture. And then, in the 14th and into the 15th century, this long and stable civilization came apart. The great villages were abandoned. The platform mounds fell silent. The canals, those extraordinary arteries maintained across 40 generations, filled with silt and were left to the desert. By the time Spanish explorers passed through the region in the late 17th century, they found no cities. They found the ruins, and they asked the local people who had built them. The answer they received gave these vanished builders their name. In the language of the O'odham people, Hohokam is often translated as something close to those who have gone, or all used up. The people who told the Spanish that name were themselves, in all likelihood, descended from the very builders they described in the past tense. What unmade them? The evidence points, as it so often does in this arid country, first to water. But here the story has a particular and revealing shape, because the danger was not only too little water, it was also too much. Tree ring records and the layered sediments of the rivers themselves tell a story of instability in the Hohokam's final centuries. There is evidence of severe, prolonged drought, the same broad climatic stresses that pressed on other southwestern peoples in this era. But there is also evidence of the opposite extreme, catastrophic floods. Around the year 1358, and possibly at other points, the Salt River appears to have flooded with tremendous force. A flood of that magnitude does not merely overflow a canal. It can carve down the riverbed itself, dropping the water level so far below the canal intakes that the entire system is stranded. The channels left dry not because the river vanished, but because it fell out of reach. Imagine the vulnerability hidden inside the Hohokam achievement. Their genius was also their exposure. The more completely they depended on the canals, the more completely a disruption to those canals threatened everything. A society this specialized, this finely tuned to the behavior of two rivers, had built its strength and its fragility from the same material. There are further pressures the evidence suggests. Centuries of irrigation can raise the salt content of the soil, slowly poisoning the fields, a problem that has undone irrigation societies elsewhere in the world. The population had grown large and concentrated. Some evidence points to social strain and conflict in the final period, as the old order fractured. And once again, the picture that emerges is not of a single blow, but of many strains converging. Climate swinging between drought and flood, soils turning against the crops, a system stretched to the edge of what it could bear and then pushed past it. The available evidence supports this braided explanation, but it does not close the case, and honest researchers say so. The precise sequence, what failed first, how quickly, and why the recovery that had followed earlier disasters did not follow this one, remains genuinely debated. The canals had been rebuilt after floods before. Communities had endured droughts before. Why, this time, did the rebuilding not come? Here, we return to a distinction that matters, and that the old accounts often got wrong. The Hohokam did not vanish from the earth. Their great, centralized, canal-dependent society dissolved, but the people did not. The archaeological and genetic and cultural evidence connects them to the O'odham peoples who live in southern Arizona today, the Accomal O'odham, the river people, and the Tohono O'odham, the desert people. When that specialized world became impossible to sustain, its inhabitants appear to have dispersed into smaller, more flexible communities, trading the vulnerable magnificence of the great canal system for ways of living the desert could not so easily break. That may be the quiet wisdom buried in the collapse. What ended was not a people, but a particular gamble, the decision to stake everything on the mastery of two rivers. When the gamble failed, the people who survived were the ones willing to let the great system go. Stand today on a bridge over one of Phoenix's modern canals, water sliding past under the desert sun, and you are looking at the continuation of an idea 1,000 years old. The lines are nearly the same. The water comes from the same rivers. The problem is identical: how to hold a city in a place that without the canals could not hold one at all. The Hohokam solved that problem for 1,000 years, longer than most civilizations last, and then the rivers reminded them that the solution had always been borrowed, never owned. The bird on the city's seal rises from flames. The people who named it knew the valley had burned before. What they could not have known, what we are still, carefully, trying to read in the silt and the tree rings and the dry beds of the ancient canals, is precisely how the fire came, and why that final time the water did not return in time to answer it. Here is a shape to hold in your mind: a perfect circle, and beside it a perfect octagon, joined together, drawn on the earth at a scale so large you cannot take it in from the ground. The octagon alone could contain 4 Roman colosseums within its walls. The circle is 1/5 of a mile across, and the two figures are not merely large, they are precise, their geometry so consistent that engineers who have surveyed them speak of the builders in the language they would use for a modern firm. Whoever laid these lines understood circles, understood squares, understood how to make one relate exactly to the other across enormous distances of open ground. This is at Newark, in central Ohio. It was built roughly 2,000 years ago, and for much of the 20th century, part of it was a golf course. That last detail is worth sitting with because it captures something essential about how these monuments have been treated, and how easily the extraordinary can hide in plain sight. For decades, players walked the fairways laid across one of the most sophisticated geometric earthworks in the ancient world, and few paused to ask who had shaped the ground beneath their feet, or how, or why. The people who shaped it left no cities of stone, no written records, no monuments we can read in words. What they left was geometry, written across the landscape of the Ohio Valley in walls of raised earth. And measuring that geometry, really measuring it, with the tools of modern survey and astronomy, has taken far longer than anyone expected, and is not finished yet. Let us be careful with names, because there are two peoples here, separated by centuries, and it is easy to blur them. The earlier are called the Adena, a culture that flourished in the Ohio Valley from roughly 800 BCE. The Adena were mound builders in the most direct sense. They raised conical burial mounds over their dead, some of them substantial. The Grave Creek Mound in West Virginia rises nearly 70 feet, one of the largest of its kind. The Adena buried their dead with care in log-lined tombs, sometimes with ornaments of copper and carved stone. Their world was one of scattered communities linked by shared burial customs and, it seems, shared belief. Then, emerging from that foundation and overlapping with its later years, came something more ambitious. Archaeologists call it Hopewell, not the name of a people, but of the 19th century farmer on whose land a major site was found. The Hopewell were not a single tribe or empire. The term describes a vast network of communities, spread across much of eastern North America, connected by trade, by ritual, and by a shared artistic and geometric tradition of astonishing reach. And their reach was, in the most literal sense, continental. This is where the artifacts begin to speak. In Hopewell burial mounds, archaeologists have found obsidian from the Rocky Mountains, more than 1,500 miles to the west, copper from the Great Lakes, shells from the Gulf of Mexico, shark's teeth from the ocean, mica from the southern Appalachians, cut into delicate silhouettes, a bird's talon, a human hand, silver from Ontario. These materials were gathered from across half a continent and brought to the Ohio Valley, where skilled hands transformed them into objects of remarkable beauty. Hold one of those mica hands up to the light, translucent and precise, and consider the distance it traveled and the intention behind every mile of that journey. Nothing about this was casual, but the artifacts, extraordinary as they are not the deepest mystery. The earthworks are. Across southern Ohio, the Hopewell built enormous geometric enclosures, circles, squares, octagons, and long parallel walls formed from raised earth. Not defensive walls, they are too low and too regular for that, often broken by wide openings, not the foundations of buildings. They enclose open space, and they do it in shapes of deliberate mathematical precision. At several sites, a perfect circle and a perfect square were built to enclose exactly the same area. A sophisticated geometric relationship, achieved with earth and human labor, at a scale of hundreds of yards. And the dimensions repeat. Researchers have found that a common unit of length appears again and again across different sites, dozens of miles apart. The square at one enclosure matches the square at another. The geometry is not local improvisation. It is a shared system, applied consistently across a wide region by people coordinating according to a common design, which raises the question that measurement keeps sharpening rather than resolving. How and why was this precision achieved by a society without writing, without metal surveying instruments, without the wheel, a society we long imagined as simple bands of hunters and gatherers and early farmers? Return to the octagon at Newark, because it holds the most demanding answer of all. In the early 1980s, two researchers, Ray Hively and Robert Horn, set out to survey the Newark earthworks carefully. They were not looking for astronomy. What they found, after painstaking measurement, was that the walls of the great octagon and circle align with the movements of the moon. Not the sun, the moon, whose cycle is far more complex and far harder to track. The earthwork appears to mark the points on the horizon where the moon rises and sets at the extremes of its 18.6-year cycle, the lunar standstill. To encode that cycle into architecture, a people must observe the horizon across nearly 2 decades, recognize a pattern that unfolds slower than childhood, and then build to it, with a precision that modern instruments confirm. And Newark is not alone. The same lunar alignments appear at another great octagon, at High Bank, built to the same geometry but oriented differently on the land, exactly as it would need to be to capture the same lunar events from a different location. Stand at the center of the Newark octagon on the right night, in the right year of that long cycle, and the moon rises precisely along the axis the builders laid down 2,000 years ago. The alignment still holds. It was built to outlast every person who made it, and it has. The mainstream interpretation, carefully stated, is this: these earthworks were ceremonial and astronomical centers, gathering places, drawing people from across the Hopewell world for rituals tied to the cycles of the sky, to burial of the dead, and to the renewal of the ties that held a far-flung network together. They were not lived in. They were, in a sense, cathedrals of earth and geometry and sky. In 2023, the most significant of them were together inscribed as a UNESCO World Heritage Site, a recognition of what the measuring had finally made undeniable. But the honest edges of our knowledge remain, and they are wide. We do not know how the astronomical knowledge was recorded and transmitted across the generations required to build to a lunar standstill. We do not know precisely how the surveying was done, what instruments of cord or sighting stake or observation allowed such accuracy across uneven, forested ground. We do not fully understand the meaning the geometry held, why a circle equal in area to a square mattered, what the numbers meant to the people who used them. And we cannot hear the beliefs behind any of it because the builders left no words. Some have gone further, proposing more elaborate systems, grand unified geometries linking site to site across the whole valley, encoded measurements pointing to advanced knowledge. Here, caution is essential. Across a landscape rich with earthworks, lines drawn between them will sometimes align by chance, and the human mind is generous in finding patterns it wishes to see. The claims that hold up are the ones confirmed by repeated independent measurement, the lunar alignments at Newark and High Bank chief among them. The rest remains for now in the territory of the possible and the unproven, and it is important to keep the two apart. What is not in doubt is the achievement itself. The precision is real, the astronomy is real, the continental trade network is real. The shared unit of measurement, applied across dozens of miles, is real. Whatever else we cannot yet say, we can say that 2,000 years ago, in the Ohio Valley, a people watched the sky with patience across decades and wrote what they saw into the earth in shapes that survey instruments still struggle to improve upon. And then, like so many others in this land, the Hopewell world drew to a close. Around 500 CE, the great earthwork construction slowed and stopped. The vast trade network contracted. The reasons are not clear. Climate shift, social change, the quiet transformation of one way of life into another. The people did not vanish. Their descendants are among the native nations of the eastern woodlands. But the era of the geometric earthworks ended, and the meaning of the shapes passed out of living memory. Much has been lost since. Of the great earthworks that once covered Ohio, hundreds of them, mapped by astonished surveyors in the 19th century, most were plowed flat for farmland or buried beneath towns. What survives is a fraction, and even that fraction we are still learning to read. The circle and the octagon remain at Newark, patient in the grass. We have measured them for 2 centuries, and each generation of instruments reveals a little more of what the builders already knew. The moon still rises where they said it would. We are, even now, only beginning to catch up to them. The effigy mounds of the upper Midwest. To see them at all, you almost have to leave the ground. From a person's height, walking across a meadow above the Mississippi in southwestern Wisconsin, they are easy to miss, long, low swells in the grass, a few feet high at most, softened by centuries of rain and root. But lift the view, rise above the tree line, and the swells resolve into something the walking eye could never assemble. A bird with a wingspan longer than a passenger jet. A bear walking. A long-tailed creature that may be a water spirit stretched across the earth. Animals laid into the land at a scale meant to be comprehended from somewhere other than where their makers stood. These are the effigy mounds, and they present a difficulty unlike almost any other ancient monument, because the thing they most conspicuously lack is the thing archaeologists most rely on. They contain almost nothing. Begin there, with the emptiness, because it shapes everything that follows. When researchers excavated effigy mounds, and they did, extensively, in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, they found that many held no burials at all. Others held a single body, or a few, placed at a meaningful point in the animal's form. The heart, the head, but there were no rich tombs, no caches of traded copper and shell like those of the Hopewell to the south, no grand goods to signal a chief or a priest, often just the shaped earth, and sometimes a hearth or a scatter of ash, and little else. A monument that holds no treasure and few dead does not easily give up its purpose. You cannot date it from grave goods it does not contain. You cannot read its social order from riches it never held. The effigy builders left their meaning in the shape itself, and the shape does not speak in words. So we build outward from the little that is certain. What is certain is when. The effigy mounds belong largely to a period from roughly 700 to 1100 CE, the late woodland era, built by communities across a region centered on what is now Wisconsin, and reaching into Iowa, Minnesota, and Illinois. These were not the people of great cities. They lived in small, mobile groups, moving with the seasons, hunting and fishing and gathering, tending gardens, gathering wild rice from the marshes. They did not farm on the intensive scale of the Mississippian towns that would later rise to the south. They lived lightly on a generous land. And yet, these mobile, dispersed people came together, repeatedly, to move earth into the shapes of animals across their landscape. Thousands upon thousands of mounds, by some early estimates once numbering 15 or 20,000 across the region, though most have since been lost to the plow and the city, stand in one of the surviving groups today, at Effigy Mounds National Monument, on the bluffs above the Mississippi in northeastern Iowa, and the setting itself begins to feel like part of the message. The mounds cluster on high ground, on ridges and terraces overlooking the great river and its valleys. The land falls away. The water shines below. Whatever these places were, they were placed with care, at the meeting points of high and low, of earth and water and sky. Now the shapes themselves. What animals did they build, and does the choice tell us anything? Certain forms recur. Birds with wings spread wide, bears, long-bodied and walking. Long-tailed creatures often described as water spirits or panthers. Deer, and distributed among them more abstract forms, long linear mounds and conical mounds of the older tradition. The animals divide, roughly, into creatures of the sky and creatures of the earth and water, birds above, bears and water spirits below. This division is the thread that leads to the mainstream interpretation, and it comes not only from the archaeology but from the living descendants of the mound builders. The Ho-Chunk Nation of Wisconsin and other native peoples of the region carry traditions that speak of a cosmos divided into an upper world and a lower world, the realm of sky and thunderbirds above, the realm of water spirits and underground powers below, with the human world held in balance between them. Seen through that understanding, the effigy mounds arrange themselves into meaning. The birds are beings of the upper world. The bears and water spirits are beings of the lower world. And the groups where they appear together, on those high bluffs between the sky and the river, may be places where the two worlds were brought into relationship, where the balance that held the cosmos together could be marked, maintained, and renewed. The available evidence supports reading these as sacred landscapes, tied to clan identity, to the honoring of the dead, and to the ceremonial ordering of the world. Many researchers believe the different animal forms were connected to social groups, that a community's clans, its bear people, and its bird people and the rest, found expression in the shapes they raised. The mounds may have been at once burial places, clan emblems, territorial markers, and cosmological diagrams. Not one purpose, several braided together, in a way our separate categories struggle to hold. But honesty requires naming what remains genuinely uncertain, and here the uncertainties are deep. We do not know, in most cases, why one mound holds a burial and another holds none. We do not know how the sites were used across the seasons, whether people gathered at them at particular times of year, and for what. We cannot securely match most individual animal shapes to specific clans or specific meanings. The correspondences that seem clear may be only part of a system largely lost to us. And the very identification of the animals is not always certain. A form called a bird by one observer has been called a different creature by another. What looks like a bear may have meant something to its makers that no modern word captures. There is also the question of alignment, approached with proper caution. Some researchers have suggested that certain effigy groups relate to the movements of the sun or the moon, or that particular mounds point toward significant horizon events. A few such claims have merit and are still being investigated, but the effigy mounds do not display the demonstrated, repeated astronomical precision found at Newark or Chaco. The evidence here is thinner, and the responsible position is to hold these suggestions as possibilities under study rather than established facts. Not every alignment a modern eye finds was intended by an ancient hand. What resists all doubt is the labor, and what the labor implies. Consider it plainly. A people who did not build cities, who moved across the land with the seasons, who left behind almost no wealth, these people repeatedly gathered to shape tons of earth into the forms of animals, at a scale legible only from above, in places chosen where the world seemed to meet. They did this thousands of times, across 4 centuries, over a vast region. That is not idle work. It is the signature of a shared belief powerful enough to organize dispersed communities around a common act again and again, for reasons that mattered to them beyond survival. And then, around 1100, the effigy tradition faded. The great animal shapes stopped being built. The reasons are not fully clear. The spread of maize agriculture, changing ways of life, the growing influence of the Mississippian world to the south, the slow transformation of one era into another. The people did not disappear. The Ho-Chunk and their neighbors are their descendants, and the mounds remain for them the work of the ancestors, sacred and alive with meaning. Much of what was built is gone. As the region was farmed and settled in the 19th and 20th centuries, the low, easily plowed mounds vanished by the thousand. What survives is a remnant, protected, now, and increasingly understood as the profound cultural landscape it always was, but a fraction of what once covered these hills and river valleys. Walk the bluffs at effigy mounds as the light lowers over the Mississippi. The great bird lies in the grass beside you, wings outstretched toward a valley its makers knew intimately, and we can only glimpse. It has lain here for 1,000 years, holding its shape, marking the seam between the world above and the world below. We can stand beside it, we can rise above it, and finally see its wings entire. But to know what it meant to lie down in this exact place, on this exact ridge, and give the earth the form of a living thing, for that, we would have to see the land the way its makers saw it, as something alive, as something ordered, as something worth shaping the ground itself to honor. The birds still fly low in the grass above the river, and they are still, patiently, watching a sky their makers understood far better than we do. Consider a single question that the American landscape has never fully answered. Across the deserts, canyons, and river bluffs of an entire continent, on tens of thousands of stone surfaces, people carved and painted images for at least the last 10,000 years, and possibly far longer. And a great many of those images we can no longer read. Not because the people who made them are gone. In many cases their descendants are here, and some of the images still speak within living traditions. But there are panels, specific walls of rock in specific canyons, where even the native nations whose ancestors likely made them will say, honestly, that the full meaning has passed beyond memory. The images remain. The reading has been lost. That is the particular character of this mystery. It is not hidden underground. It is out in the open, in daylight, on the rock, where anyone can stand before it. And it holds its meaning anyway. Start with the two words, because they name two different acts. A petroglyph is carved, pecked, incised, or ground into the stone, so that the image is the rock itself, reshaped. A pictograph is painted, pigment applied to the surface, red from iron ochre, black from charcoal or manganese, white from clay or gypsum. One removes stone to make an image, the other adds color to it. Both have survived in places for thousands of years, the carvings by their sheer physical persistence, the paintings by the shelter of overhangs, and the strange durability of mineral pigment bonded to stone. They are found in every region of what is now the United States. This is not a local phenomenon. From the Columbia River in the Pacific Northwest to the canyons of the Southwest, from the Great Basin to the bluffs of the eastern woodlands to the shores of the Great Lakes, people marked the stone. The impulse was continental, spanning cultures that never met and languages that shared no words. And the time depth is difficult to hold in the mind. Some rock art in North America is only a few centuries old, recent enough that its maker's descendants can still explain it. Some is far older. In the Great Basin, certain petroglyphs have been dated, by the mineral crusts that formed over them, to many thousands of years, placing them among the oldest known rock art in the Americas, made by some of the earliest peoples to walk this land. Stand before a Great Basin panel in the low desert light. The carved lines are the color of the rock beneath a darker skin of mineral varnish, a patina that took millennia to form. The age is not an abstraction here. You can see it in the depth of the desert varnish that has grown back into the grooves since the day a hand first cut them. Now, what did they make? Here the images divide, roughly, into kinds, and the divide matters for what we can and cannot understand. Some rock art is representational and reads almost immediately. Bighorn sheep by the thousands across the Southwest and Great Basin. Deer, hunters with bows, riders on horses, the horse itself a marker of time, since it arrived with Europeans, dating any panel that shows it to the last few centuries. Human figures with shields, handprints pressed or painted directly onto the stone, the most intimate image a person can leave. I was here, this is my hand. These we can name, even when we cannot fully explain why they were made. But then there are the other images. And this is where the reading falters. Across the Colorado Plateau, in the deep canyons of Utah, there are painted figures that resemble nothing in the ordinary world. Tall, tapering forms, human in outline but without arms or legs, their bodies filled with intricate patterns, their heads bearing what look like antennae or halos or great staring eyes, or no eyes at all, only hollows. Some stand life-sized, some are far larger. They are called, after the canyon where the finest examples survive, the Barrier Canyon style. And they are old, likely several thousand years old, made by hunter-gatherers of the desert archaic, long before the Puebloan farmers came. They do not look like people going about their lives. They look like presences, and no living tradition can tell us with certainty who or what they were meant to be. This is the honest center of the subject, and it must be stated carefully. When we say a panel cannot be explained, we do not mean it is inexplicable in principle, or the work of some lost superior race, or evidence of visitors from elsewhere. We mean something more specific and more human, that the particular culture which made these images thousands of years ago did not survive intact into the present with its interpretation of them unbroken. The thread of oral transmission, the person who could stand before the figure and say what it was cut somewhere across the long centuries. The image outlived its explanation. So, how do researchers approach meaning at all when the direct testimony is gone? The mainstream approach draws on several sources, used together and with restraint. The first and most important is the knowledge of native descendant communities, wherever it survives, for a great deal of rock art is not mysterious at all to the peoples whose ancestors made it, and their understanding is primary. The second is careful study of the images themselves. What is depicted, where, in what relationships, at what kinds of places. The third is comparison. Patterns that recur across many sites suggesting shared meaning. From this work, several interpretations have emerged for the images that lie beyond living memory. Some rock art appears tied to hunting, marking places where game was taken or sought. Some clearly relates to water, clustered at springs and seeps in arid country. Some marks the sky, panels positioned to catch a shaft of light at the solstice, turning the stone into a calendar. And some, many researchers believe, is connected to the spiritual and the visionary, to shamanic practice, to altered states of consciousness, to the experiences of individuals who crossed or believed they crossed into other worlds. The strange, armless figures in this reading may be depictions not of people, but of spirits, or of the human self transformed. This last interpretation is influential, and it fits some of the evidence well. But it is important to say that it is an interpretation, not a proven fact, and that scholars continue to debate how widely it should be applied. Not every unusual figure is a vision. Not every panel is a doorway to another world. The responsible position holds these readings as informed possibilities, tested against evidence, never mistaken for the certainty of a caption. There is one site that gathers all of this, the wonder, the depth, the humility, into a single place. In western Nevada lies Winnemucca Lake, now a dry basin. On its limestone, researchers have documented deeply carved abstract designs, diamonds, branching lines, forms that suggest nothing obvious. What sets them apart is their age. By dating the carbonate layers on the rock, scientists concluded these petroglyphs may be older than 14,000 years, potentially the oldest rock art yet found in North America. They were made by people near the very beginning of the human presence in this land, and their meaning is entirely beyond recovery. Sit with that dry lake bed for a moment. The carvings are abstract. No animal, no hunter, no hand. Just geometry, cut into stone by someone who stood here when the lake still held water and the first Americans were still learning the shape of a new world. Whatever those diamonds meant, the person who cut them knew. We can only look, and yet the record is not silent. That is the counterweight, and it deserves the last word before the reflection. For all the panels we cannot read, there are countless others we can, because the traditions held. The Hopi, the Zuni, the peoples of the Columbia River, the nations of the Great Lakes and the Southwest and beyond, many can still stand before the marks of their ancestors and speak their meaning, connecting clan symbols, migration accounts, sacred beings, and events to the images on the stone. The rock art is not a dead script. Much of it is a living one, and where it lives, it should be understood first through the people to whom it still belongs. The strongest thing we can say, in the end, is also the simplest. For as long as there have been people on this continent, they have chosen certain stones, not all stones, but particular ones, at springs and canyon mouths and high overlooks and quiet shelters, and marked them. They did it for 10,000 years and more. They did it to record, to honor, to summon, to remember, to mark the sky and the hunt and the crossing into other worlds. The specific reasons vary, and many are lost. The impulse does not. Walk a canyon at the end of the day where the painted figures stand on the wall in the fading light, filled with patterns no living person fully understands. They have watched this canyon far longer than any nation now on the earth. They were made by hands that meant something exact by every line. We stand where those hands stood. We look at what they left. And in the places where the meaning has gone, we are left with something quieter and no less real. The plain, enduring fact of their attention. Someone stood here. Someone looked at this stone and chose it, and made a mark that has outlasted their language, their people's name, and every word they ever spoke. The mark remains. It is still speaking. We have simply lost the sound of the voice. 7,000 years ago, on the shores of Lake Superior, someone shaped a spear point out of pure metal, and in doing so, joined the very small company of peoples anywhere on Earth who had learned to work metal at all. Not smelted, not cast, not alloyed, but hammered and heated, and formed with real skill into a tool with a socket and an edge, from a material that most of the ancient world would not touch for thousands of years to come. This happened in the western Great Lakes, in what is now Michigan and Wisconsin, at a time when the Great Pyramids of Egypt lay millennia in the future, and the metalworkers of the Old World had barely begun. It is one of the oldest metalworking traditions known anywhere on the planet, and for a long time, the wider world did not believe it. That disbelief is part of the story, and worth understanding, because it shaped how long the truth took to be accepted. When 19th and early 20th century scholars first encountered ancient copper tools from the Great Lakes, they struggled to fit them into the framework they had inherited. That framework was a ladder, stone, then bronze, then iron, each stage in advance, each culture climbing the rungs in order. Metal meant progress. Metal meant civilization on the march. And here was metal, genuine, worked metal. In the hands of people the framework had filed under primitive. The pieces did not fit the ladder, so the ladder, for a time, refused the pieces. The resolution came from an unusual quality of the Great Lakes deposits, and here the geology is the key that unlocks everything. Most copper in the world occurs as ore, the metal chemically bound up inside rock, requiring smelting, the application of intense heat to break those bonds and release it. Smelting is a genuine technological threshold, difficult to cross, and its invention marks a real turning point in human history. But around Lake Superior, the copper is different. It occurs native, as pure metal, in nuggets and veins and masses, some of them enormous, sitting in the rock and in the glacial gravels, already in the form the metal worker needs. It did not have to be smelted out. It had only to be found and freed and worked. Pick up a piece of native Lake Superior copper. It has a weight and a warmth that stone does not. Turned in the light, it shows the dull red-gold sheen of metal, the same gleam that would later drive empires, lying loose in the ground for anyone with the knowledge to gather it. This geological gift is the beginning of the answer, but it is not the whole of it because finding the copper is not the same as mastering it. The people of what archaeologists call the old copper complex did master it. Working the metal cold makes it hard but brittle. It cracks. The solution is a technique called annealing, heating the metal, then working it, then heating it again, cycling between the two to shape it without shattering it. The old copper people understood this. They hammered and annealed native copper into a genuine toolkit. Socketed spear points, knives, awls, fishhooks, harpoons, axes, ornaments. Functional, refined, and produced in real quantity over thousands of years. The dating is where the significance becomes fully clear, and it has only grown more striking as the methods have improved. Radiocarbon dates from old copper sites reach back remarkably far. By current evidence, the tradition was well underway by around 6,000 to 7,000 years ago, and some findings push its beginnings earlier still. This places the Great Lakes among the earliest centers of metalworking anywhere, comparable in antiquity to the very oldest metal traditions of the Near East, and in some respects preceding them. People in North America were shaping metal tools while most of humanity, on every continent, still worked entirely in stone, bone, and wood. Sit with the strangeness of that ordering. The story we are usually told runs from the Old World outward, with the Americas arriving late to every technology. Here, near the beginning of the human presence in this land, is a tradition that reverses the expectation entirely. Now, the mainstream interpretation, stated carefully, because it contains a genuine and interesting puzzle. Archaeologists broadly agree on the facts: the antiquity, the skill, the scale, the reliance on native copper worked by hammering and annealing rather than smelting. What they debate is a curious later development. Over the span of the old copper tradition, something shifted. In its earlier phases, copper was worked heavily into practical tools, the spear points and knives and harpoons of a working life. But over time, the emphasis appears to have moved away from utility and toward ornament and display. The later copper turns up less as tools and more as beads, bracelets, and ceremonial objects, often accompanying the dead in burials. This is the puzzle that has drawn the most thought. A people developed a functional metal technology, thousands of years old, and then, at least in part, seem to have stepped back from using it for function, redirecting the metal toward beauty, status, and ceremony instead. Several interpretations have been proposed, and researchers continue to weigh them. One is practical. For all its qualities, worked native copper is not dramatically superior to good stone for many everyday tasks. A finely knapped stone point can be sharper. Stone is far more abundant and easier to replace. Copper is heavy, labor-intensive to gather from distant sources, and demanding to work. It is possible that, having tried copper for tools, these communities found that stone simply served better for daily use, and that copper's true value lay elsewhere. And elsewhere may mean something deeper than convenience. This is the second interpretation, and it reframes the whole question. Copper, in the later tradition and among the cultures that followed, appears to have carried profound social and possibly spiritual meaning. It was rare. It came from specific sacred places. It gleamed like nothing else in the natural world. To possess it, to wear it, to be buried with it, may have signaled status, identity, connection to powerful forces. In this light, the shift from tool to ornament is not a retreat from technology at all. It is a recognition that the metal's greatest power was never in the cutting edge. It was in what the copper meant. The available evidence does not allow us to choose between these readings with certainty, and they may both be partly true. What is clear is that copper's role in these societies was never governed by function alone. There is a physical dimension to all this that deserves its own moment, because it is written into the land itself. On the Keweenaw Peninsula of Michigan and on Isle Royale in Lake Superior are thousands of ancient mining pits, places where, for thousands of years, people extracted copper from the rock. They used stone hammers and fire and cold water to crack the stone, and patient labor to work the metal free. The scale of this activity, sustained across millennia, was considerable. This was not casual scavenging of surface nuggets. It was mining, organized and enduring, at some of the oldest such sites known anywhere in the Americas. Stand at the edge of one of those old pits on Isle Royale, softened now by moss and time, and consider how many generations came to this exact place for the same red metal. How long the knowledge held, passed from hand to hand across a span of time longer than all of recorded history. Yet honesty requires marking the limits of what we know, and they are real. We cannot always say with precision how the earliest copper was worked, or exactly when the tradition truly began, as new dating occasionally pushes the horizon backward. We do not fully understand the transition from tool to ornament, how gradual it was, how universal, how much it varied from community to community, and we cannot recover the meaning the copper held in the minds of its makers, only infer it from how they used it and how they buried it. The metal survives. The beliefs that surrounded it do not, except as echoes in the practices of the peoples who came after. We should also resist the temptation to make too much of the firsts. That this was among the earliest metalworking on Earth is remarkable and true. But the point is not to award the Great Lakes a medal in some global race, or to measure these people against the yardstick of the Old World's later bronze and iron. That yardstick was always the wrong one. The old copper people did not fail to invent smelting. They had abundant, pure metal and no need of it. They did not lag behind a ladder of progress. They were never on that ladder at all. They met the particular gift their land offered, this strange, gleaming, workable metal lying in the ground, and they answered it with thousands of years of skill and meaning. That is not a rung. It is a whole way of living with a material, on its own terms. The copper is still there in the rock of the Quinaw and beneath the waters of the Great Lake, the same pure metal that drew people to these shores 7,000 years ago. Some of it still lies where the ancient miners left it, in pits gone quiet under the northern forest. And perhaps that is the truest measure of what happened here. Not that these people were first, but that they looked at a shining stone most of the world would not learn to use for ages, and understood so early that it was worth something. What exactly it was worth to them, tool, treasure, or sacred thing, the copper keeps to itself, holding its old gleam in the dark ground, waiting for whatever we manage to understand next. A bird that could not survive the winter here was living here anyway. The scarlet macaw is a creature of the tropics, of the humid lowland forests of southern Mexico and Central America, 1,000 miles and more from the high, cold deserts of the American Southwest. It cannot endure a northern winter. It cannot breed easily outside its warm native range. And yet the bones of scarlet macaws turn up again and again in the ancient pueblos of Arizona and New Mexico, kept, it seems, as living birds, their brilliant red and blue feathers prized far beyond the reach of the forests that produce them. Follow that bird, and it leads you south, down through the deserts, across the modern border that meant nothing to the people who made these journeys, and into the mountains of northern Mexico, to a place where the macaws were not merely kept, but bred in numbers on purpose. The bird is a thread. Pull it, and an entire connected world begins to unspool, running deep into Mexico and back again. This chapter follows that thread and the people who carried it. Begin in the north with the Salado, because they are the near end of the connection and in their own way, a small mystery of their own. Around the 13th and 14th centuries, in the Tonto Basin of central Arizona, and across a wide surrounding region, a distinctive way of life took shape. Archaeologists named it the Salado, after the Salt River. Its most recognizable signature is a kind of pottery, Salado polychrome, boldly painted in red, black, and white, decorated with intricate designs that carry unmistakable symbolic weight. What makes the Salado interesting is how widely that pottery spread, and how little it respects the old boundaries. Salado polychrome appears across an enormous area of the Southwest, cutting across communities that otherwise differed in language, architecture, and origin. For a long time, scholars debated whether the Salado were a distinct people, a migration, or something harder to define. The interpretation that has gained ground is subtler and more interesting than a simple tribe. Many researchers now understand the Salado phenomenon less as a population than as a shared system of belief and practice, a religious or ideological movement expressed through that vivid pottery and its symbols, which spread across diverse communities and bound them loosely together. Not a people who conquered or migrated en masse, but an idea that traveled, taken up by many groups who kept their own identities while sharing in something larger. Hold one of those polychrome vessels in the mind's eye, the crisp geometric bands, the stepped and spiraling motifs in red and black on white. The symbols meant something. They were a language of design, understood across a wide and varied land. And that language points south. Because the symbols on Salado pottery and the beliefs they seem to encode connect to a broader world of meaning, whose most powerful expression lay not in Arizona at all, but far below it, at a remarkable site in the Mexican state of Chihuahua. Its name is Paquimé, also called Casas Grande. For anyone who has absorbed the usual picture of the ancient Southwest, modest pueblos, farming villages, a world of local scale, Paquimé rearranges the furniture. It was a true urban center, at its height between roughly 1200 and 1450, sprawling across the desert of northern Mexico. Multi-story buildings of adobe, some rising several floors, housed a population in the thousands. There were public plazas, platform mounds, some shaped as effigies, ball courts in the Mesoamerican tradition, an engineered water system channeled through the settlement. Paquimé was something the region had rarely seen, a city sitting at a crossroads between the Pueblo world to the north and the great civilizations of Mesoamerica to the south, and at Paquimé the macaws come into focus. Within the ruins, archaeologists found room after room built for birds, specialized adobe cages, nesting boxes with stone doorways sized for a macaw to pass through, and the remains of hundreds of scarlet macaws, far more than could occur naturally this far north. Paquimé was breeding them. It was, in effect, a macaw farm, raising these tropical birds in the desert, almost certainly to harvest their feathers and to trade the living birds and their plumage across the region. Consider what that requires. To breed scarlet macaws so far from their native range, people had to obtain breeding stock from the distant tropical south. Keep the birds alive through conditions they were never built for. Understand their needs well enough to raise new generations, and then move the results, feathers and living birds, outward across hundreds of miles of desert to the communities that craved them. This was not casual trade. It was a deliberate enterprise, a node in a network that reached from the rainforests of the far south to the pueblos of the far north. The macaws are the vivid part, but they traveled in company. The broader evidence of this connection is abundant, and it flows in both directions. Copper bells, cast by the lost wax method in western Mexico, appear in southwestern sites, objects of a metallurgical tradition rooted far to the south. Marine shell from the Gulf of California and the Pacific coast moved inland and north in great quantities, worked into ornaments. Cacao, chocolate, a thoroughly Mesoamerican substance, has been detected as residue in vessels at Chaco Canyon and elsewhere in the southwest, carried up from regions where the cacao tree grows. And ideas moved too. The ball courts, the platform mounds, the imagery of the horned or feathered serpent, a powerful Mesoamerican religious figure whose presence echoes through southwestern art and, some argue, through the symbolism of the Salado world itself. Stand in the eroded adobe corridors of Paquimé as the desert light moves across the walls, and the old assumption of a southwest sealed off from the great cultures of Mexico simply falls away. This was a doorway. Through it passed birds, metal, shell, chocolate, and belief. Now the mainstream reading, held with appropriate care. Historians and archaeologists generally agree that the ancient Southwest and Mesoamerica were genuinely connected, that goods, and to some degree ideas and people, moved along corridors linking the two regions across centuries. Paquimé is widely seen as a major hub in the later phase of this exchange, and the macaw evidence makes the trade in tropical goods concrete and undeniable. The Salado ideology, with its far-flung pottery and its southern-tinged symbolism, is often read as part of this same broad current of contact and shared meaning. But the nature and intensity of the connection remain genuinely debated, and this is where honesty matters most. At one end of the spectrum, some have proposed strong models, that Mesoamerican states, or long-distance merchants in their service, figures sometimes compared to the Pochteca traders of the later Aztec world, reached north to organize trade, extract resources, or exert real influence over the southwestern peoples. In this view, places like Paquimé might have been founded or directed by southern interests, outposts of a Mesoamerican reach. At the other end, many researchers argue for something more modest and more locally driven, that southwestern peoples were not passive recipients of southern influence but active participants, adopting and adapting the goods and ideas that suited them on their own terms, through down-the-line trade that passed objects hand to hand across many communities without any single organizing power behind it. In this reading, Paquimé is a local creation that flourished by tapping into southern connections. Not a colony, but a southwestern city that looked south and profited. The available evidence does not settle the matter cleanly, and it may contain truth on both sides at different times and places. What is not in doubt is the fact of contact. The macaw bones, the copper bells, the cacao residue, the ball quartz, these are not ambiguous. Whatever the mechanism, the two worlds were in real and sustained relationship. There is a further uncertainty worth naming, the timing and the fall. Paquimé rose relatively late and did not last. By around 1450, before the Spanish arrived, the great city was in decline and eventually abandoned. Its causes, drought, conflict, the unraveling of the trade networks that sustained it, still under study. The Salado way of life, too, faded in the 15th century. The connections that had linked the deserts to the tropics thinned and, in time, went quiet. When the Spanish came north in the 16th century, they found the ruins of Paquimé already ancient, and asked, as newcomers always do, who had built them. What endures is the shape of the relationship, and the reminder it carries. The peoples of the ancient Southwest were never as isolated as the old maps implied. They lived at the northern edge of a vast, interconnected world, one that ran south through Paquimé and onward into the heart of Mesoamerica, a world of traders and pilgrims and craftsmen moving valuable and meaningful things across distances that would daunt a traveler even now. The clearest witness to it all remains the bird, a creature of the rainforest, carried north into the desert against every natural odds, bred in adobe rooms under a sky it was never meant to fly beneath, kept and treasured for the impossible color it brought to a world of stone and earth and sun. The macaws are gone from Paquimé now, but their bones remain in its ruined rooms, small and certain, a tropical signature pressed into the northern desert. Proof, if any single thing can be, of how far these ancient roads truly ran, and how much people were willing to carry along them. The Itawa and Southeastern Mound centers. Two marble figures, a man and a woman, sat in the darkness of a burial chamber inside a mound in Georgia for something like 500 years before anyone living saw them again. They are nearly life-sized, carved with care, their features calm and deliberate. The man kneels. The woman sits with her legs folded beneath her. When archaeologists recovered them from Mound C at the Etowah site, they emerged intact from the earth. Not fragments, not weathered hints, but complete sculptures, the work of a people who could render the human form in stone with confidence and grace. They are among the finest pieces of pre-Columbian art produced anywhere in what is now the eastern United States, and they were made by a society most Americans have never heard of. That gap between the sophistication of the art and the near-total absence of these people from the common memory of the country built on top of them is the quiet scandal running underneath this entire story. Let us close it, starting with the place where those two figures were buried. Etowah lies in northwestern Georgia, in a bend of the Etowah River, about an hour north of modern Atlanta. What survives there today is a set of earthen mounds rising from a flat river valley, the largest of them climbing more than 60 feet, a flat-topped pyramid of packed soil, broad enough that a substantial building once stood upon its summit. Around the mounds ran a defensive ditch and a palisade. Between them once spread a town, home to several thousand people at its height. This was not a village, it was a capital. Etowah was one of the principal centers of the Mississippian world, the last great flowering of mound-building civilization in North America, which rose across the American Southeast and Midwest from roughly 800 to 1600 CE. The Mississippian peoples were farmers, above all of corn, whose reliable surplus allowed towns to grow, populations to concentrate, and society to organize itself into something more layered and hierarchical than what had come before. Their world was one of towns and territories, each typically centered on mounds like these, ruled by powerful leaders whose authority joined the political and the sacred. Anthropologists call these societies chiefdoms, ranked, hereditary, and centered on a paramount leader, a chief who was at once ruler, high priest, and living link to the powers that governed the cosmos. To grasp Etowah, picture the summit of that great mound as it was. A temple, or the chief's residence, raised above the town on its earthen platform, closer to the sky than any other structure, visible to everyone below. The mound was not a tomb in the ordinary sense. It was a stage and a statement, elevation made literal, power expressed as height. The higher the platform, the closer its occupant to the sacred, and the greater the labor the society had poured into raising him there. Now the art, because the art is how these people speak to us most directly across the silence of the centuries. From Etowah and other major Mississippian centers, Moundville in Alabama, Cahokia in Illinois, Spiro in Oklahoma, Ocmulgee in Georgia, comes a body of imagery so consistent, so widely shared, that scholars recognized it as a single, interconnected tradition. It was long called the Southeastern Ceremonial Complex, and more recently, the Mississippian Ideological Interaction Sphere. Whatever the name, the phenomenon is real. Across hundreds of miles and many distinct communities, the same symbols and the same iconography recur. The objects themselves are extraordinary. Copper plates hammered into the images of winged, hawk-like beings, human figures in the costume of falcons, arms spread as wings, marked with the forked eye of the bird of prey. Shell gorgets, ornaments worn at the throat, engraved with spiders, with coiled serpents, with looping crosses and sunbursts and dancing warriors. Ceremonial blades chipped from stone in forms too large and too fine ever to have been used. Effigy pipes carved into human and animal shapes. Repeated across all of it, the cross in circle, likely a symbol of the sacred fire in the four directions. The forked eye, the hand and eye motif, the great winged warrior. Hold on one of those copper falcon dancers, gleaming faintly in museum light. The spread wings, the fierce profiled face, the sense of a being in motion between the human and the more than human. These images were charged with meaning. They belonged to a coherent view of the cosmos, shared across a vast region. The mainstream interpretation reads this iconography as the visual language of Mississippian religion and power, bound tightly together. The imagery draws on a cosmos divided into layers, an upper world, a lower world, and the human realm between, and on themes of warfare, fertility, ancestry, and the movement of the sun. The falcon warrior likely expressed the martial and celestial authority of elite men. The chiefs and their kin used these sacred symbols to display and justify their position, weaving their earthly power into the fabric of the sacred order. Art, religion, and rule were not separate things. They were one system, and the objects were its instruments. What remains genuinely uncertain is how it all worked in practice, and here the questions multiply. We cannot fully reconstruct the specific beliefs behind the symbols. We can read the cross and circle as sacred fire, the forked eye as the falcon, but the fuller mythology, the stories, the names, the rituals these images served, is only partly recoverable, pieced together from the art itself and from the traditions of later southeastern peoples like the Muskogee, Cherokee, and others who descend from this world. We do not know precisely how the wider Mississippian network functioned, whether the shared iconography traveled through trade, through pilgrimage, through the movement of elites and their craftsmen, or through some combination we cannot yet resolve, and the political reality of these chiefdoms is still debated, how centralized they truly were, how far a paramount chief's power actually reached, how stable the whole arrangement was. That last question turns out to be central, because instability may have been built into these societies from the start. The archaeological record shows that Mississippian chiefdoms were volatile. They rose, expanded, and fell apart with striking regularity. A center like Etowah did not simply flourish across the centuries. The evidence suggests it was occupied, abandoned, and reoccupied more than once, its fortunes rising and collapsing over time. Researchers describe this pattern as cycling, the recurrent tendency of these chiefdoms to build up power around a paramount center, then fragment as rival elites, succession disputes, warfare, or failing harvests pulled them apart, only for the process to begin again elsewhere. Etowah itself bears the marks of violence. Its defensive ditch and palisade were not decorative. At Mound C, there is evidence of a time when the sacred precinct was attacked, its elite burials disturbed, its ritual objects, perhaps even those two marble figures, thrown down or carried off. Power here was contested and could be violently overturned. The collapse of the Mississippian world, though, was ultimately driven by something the chiefdoms had never faced before. When Spanish expeditions under Hernando de Soto pushed through the southeast in the mid-16th century, they passed through a landscape still alive with functioning mound centers, chiefs, and towns, and they recorded it. Those accounts are precious, a European eyewitness glimpse of the Mississippian world still in motion. But the expeditions also carried something invisible and catastrophic: Old World diseases, to which the peoples of the Americas had no immunity. What followed, across the century and a half after contact, was demographic collapse on a scale difficult to comprehend. Epidemics swept through populations with no resistance, and the tightly organized, densely settled chiefdoms were acutely vulnerable. Towns emptied. The intricate hierarchies that depended on stable populations and hereditary authority came apart. By the time later Europeans arrived to settle the interior southeast, the great mound centers stood largely abandoned, and the societies that built them had been transformed beyond recognition, their survivors regrouping into the native nations the newcomers would later encounter. This is where persistent and damaging misconception must be set aside. The mounds were not, as later settlers often insisted, the work of some vanished race, a lost tribe, a wandering Old World people, anyone but the ancestors of the Native Americans who still lived nearby. That myth was a convenient fiction, and it was false. The builders of Etowah and Moundville and the rest were the direct ancestors of the Muscogee Creek, the Cherokee, the Chickasaw, the Choctaw, and other southeastern nations, peoples who endured the catastrophe of contact, and who endure still, carrying the memory of the mound-building world forward even after so much was taken from them. Walk the grounds at Etowah today, where the Great Mound rises green against the Georgia sky and the river bends quietly past. The palisade is gone. The town is gone. The falcon dancers and the marble figures rest now in museum cases. What remains is the shaped earth and the art, and the descendants who still know these places as their own. The two stone figures sit again in the light, the man kneeling, the woman with her legs folded beneath her, their calm faces turned toward a world that vanished around them. They were carved to honor something, an ancestor, a lineage, a bond between the living and the dead that anchored an entire society. That society is gone. The bond it expressed and the people who carried it proved harder to erase. The stone kept its shape through 5 centuries of darkness. Its maker's descendants kept something harder to bury, and they are still here to say so. For generations, geologists dismissed it as a story. Along the Pacific Northwest coast, the native peoples told of a night when the ocean rose without warning, when whole villages were swept away in darkness, when the sea drew back and then returned as a wall of water, and the survivors woke to find the coast remade and the dead uncountable. It was told as history, passed down through the families who remembered it, tied to specific places along the shore. And for a long time, Western science had no category for it but folklore. Then the geologists found the earthquake. In the late 20th century, researchers established that a massive earthquake had struck the Cascadia subduction zone off the coast of what is now Washington and Oregon, generating an enormous tsunami. They could even date it, with startling precision, to the night of January 26, 1700. They knew the date because the same tsunami had crossed the entire Pacific Ocean and struck the coast of Japan, where scribes recorded the arrival of an orphan tsunami, a great wave with no local earthquake to explain it. Japanese written records and North American oral records were describing the same night, from opposite sides of the world. The story was not folklore. It was an eyewitness account, carried across 3 centuries by memory alone, and it was correct. This is where our subject begins, not with a ruin or an artifact, but with the meeting of 2 ways of holding the past. On one side, the archaeological and documentary record, physical evidence, dated and measured, the method by which Western scholarship reconstructs history. On the other, oral tradition, knowledge preserved and transmitted through spoken word across generations, the way most human societies for most of human history have carried their past. This chapter is about what happens where those 2 ways meet, where they confirm each other, where they diverge, and where together they still leave gaps that neither can fill alone. For most of the history of American archaeology, the relationship between the 2 was badly out of balance. Native oral traditions were treated, at best, as charming stories with no evidentiary weight, and at worst, as obstacles to be brushed aside. The assumption was that spoken memory degraded quickly, that anything not written down dissolved within a few generations into myth. Physical evidence was real, testimony was not, and so the accounts of the very peoples whose history was being excavated were often left out of the reconstruction entirely. That assumption has not survived contact with the evidence. The Cascadia tsunami is only the most dramatic case. Again and again, where oral traditions can be tested against independent physical evidence, they have proven to carry real, durable information across spans of time far longer than anyone once believed possible. Australian Aboriginal traditions describe coastlines that were drowned by rising seas thousands of years ago at the end of the last ice age. Descriptions that match the ancient shorelines geologists have since mapped beneath the water. Klamath traditions in Oregon describe the volcanic events that formed Crater Lake, which geology dates to an eruption roughly 7,000 years ago. Certain traditions appear to preserve the memory of events at the very edge of the last glacial period. Sit with what that means. A story told aloud, parent to child, keeper to apprentice, holding its essential truth across not decades but thousands of years, outlasting empires, outlasting written languages that have since gone silent, arriving in the present still bearing an accurate core. So the mainstream position among archaeologists has genuinely shifted, and this is the accepted background now. Oral tradition is increasingly recognized as a legitimate source of historical and environmental knowledge. Not infallible, but not empty either. Serious researchers now work in collaboration with descendant communities, treating their traditions as evidence to be taken seriously alongside the physical record, rather than as decoration or as superstition to be corrected. The relationship, at its best, has become a partnership. But partnership does not mean the two records always agree, and the places where they diverge are as important as the places where they align. The clearest divergence is one of kind, not merely of content. Oral traditions and archaeological evidence often are not trying to answer the same question. Archaeology asks what physically happened, when, and how. Oral tradition frequently asks something different. What does this place mean? Who are we in relation to it? What is our origin and our obligation? A tradition of emergence, of a people coming into this world from a world below, is not a failed attempt at geology. It is a statement about identity, belonging, and the sacred, operating in a register that radiocarbon dating cannot touch and was never meant to. To treat such a tradition as merely a wrong answer to a scientific question is to misunderstand what it is. And to treat archaeology as merely a colonial imposition with nothing to offer is to discard a genuine tool for reconstructing the physical past. Both records are real. They simply do different work, and the mistake in either direction is to demand that one become the other. This tension becomes concrete and sometimes painful at specific sites and over specific questions. Consider the peopling of the Americas. The dominant archaeological models describe human migration into the continent from Asia, across the Bering Land Bridge or along the coast, at the end of the Ice Age, an arrival from elsewhere at a datable point in time. Many native traditions, by contrast, hold that their peoples originated here, in this land, emerging into it at the beginning. These are not easily reconciled. For some, the scientific account of migration feels like one more external story imposed on peoples who know, from their own deepest traditions, that they have always been here. The disagreement is not trivial, and it is not merely academic. It touches questions of sovereignty, of ancestral claim, of who has the authority to say where a people comes from. The controversy over ancient human remains has made this tension unavoidable. When very old skeletons are found on the continent, the questions multiply immediately. Who were these people? Are they the ancestors of living native nations? And if so, of which? Who has the right to study them, to keep them, to return them to the earth? Cases like that of the remains, once called Kennewick Man, studied for years over the objections of native peoples who regarded him as an ancestor, before genetic analysis ultimately affirmed his connection to living Native Americans, and he was returned for reburial. Show how archaeology and native memory can pull hard against each other, and also sometimes how they can eventually arrive at the same place. Stand at the center of that disagreement and resist the urge to resolve it too quickly. The honest position holds real respect for both the physical evidence and the living traditions, and admits that in some cases they may not be fully reconcilable, that we may be left holding two accounts that do not merge into one. Because gaps remain that neither record can close, and pretending otherwise serves no one. Oral traditions, for all their durability, are not verbatim archives. They carry meaning across time, but the further back they reach, the more they compress, telescope, and transform, an event and its significance preserved, while names, dates, and sequences blur. Archaeology, for all its precision, is radically incomplete. It recovers the durable and loses the perishable, preserves the pot and loses the song, the ceremony, the spoken law, the belief. Neither method can reconstruct the inner life of a vanished community, what people felt, what they intended, what a symbol meant to the person who carved it. Between the two records lies a vast territory that belonged to human experience and has left no trace either could capture. And there is a further, quieter loss beneath all of this. So much oral tradition was itself destroyed, not because it was fragile, but because the chains of transmission were deliberately broken. The catastrophe of contact, the loss of speakers, the suppression of languages, the removal of children from the communities that would have taught them. These severed countless lines of memory that had held for centuries, and might have held for centuries more. What we are working with is not the full body of native knowledge. It is what survived a sustained effort to erase it. The gaps in the record are not all natural. Some were made. What endures where it endures is therefore precious in a way that is easy to understate. A tradition that has come down to the present has passed through fire to get here. When a native historian today can stand before a mound, a canyon, a stretch of drowned coastline, and speak of what happened there in the time of the ancestors, that testimony carries the weight of everything it survived to reach us. The wave that struck the northwest coast on that January night in 1700 left its mark in three places. In the drowned forests and buried sands the geologists would eventually read, in the careful records of Japanese scribes across the ocean, and in the memory of the people who lived through it and told their children, who told theirs. 3 records, 3 ways of holding a single night. For 300 years they lay apart, each incomplete, none aware of the others. And then, briefly they came together, and the night could be seen almost whole. That is the rare and hopeful case, the moment when the separate ways of remembering align, and the past comes into focus with a clarity none of them could have reached alone. It does not always happen. Often, the records stay apart, or contradict, or fall silent exactly where we most want them to speak. But the wave is a reminder of what becomes possible when we stop asking which kind of memory is real, and start asking what each of them, listened to with care, still has to say. There is a stretch of the Mississippi River Valley that archaeologists have named, with unusual bluntness, the vacant quarter. It covers a vast area, parts of what are now Kentucky, Tennessee, Missouri, Illinois, and Arkansas, the fertile heart of the mid-continent, land that had once held some of the densest populations north of Mexico. And by the time the first Europeans pushed into the interior, much of it was empty, not sparsely settled, not in decline. Empty, a great quiet region where thriving Mississippian towns had stood a century or two before, now abandoned, their mounds standing silent over land where no one lived. The emptiness itself is the evidence, and it raises a question that unsettles one of the most familiar stories in American history. We are taught that the catastrophe came with the Europeans, that contact brought the diseases, the violence, and the collapse that emptied Native America. Much of that is true, and terribly so, but the vacant quarter complicates the timeline, because in some regions the emptying appears to have begun before the Europeans arrived to cause it. The people were already leaving. Something was already happening. And the newcomers, when they came, walked into a land that had, in places, been in motion for generations. This chapter is about that unsettling gap in the timeline, the depopulation that came, in some places, too early to blame on contact. Begin with what makes the question so difficult, because the difficulty is the honest starting point. To know whether a region emptied before or after Europeans arrived, you need to date the emptying precisely. And precision at this remove is hard. Radiocarbon dating carries margins of error measured in decades. The historical records of the first European expeditions are scattered, incomplete, and often unclear about exactly where they went and what they saw. The very diseases that may have driven early depopulation leave almost no direct mark in the archaeological record. A village emptied by epidemic looks much like a village emptied by migration or famine, so the researchers work at the edge of what the evidence can support, and they say so. What the evidence does show, in several regions, is a pattern of decline that runs deeper into the past than the moment of contact. Take the vacant quarter itself. The abandonment of the central Mississippi Valley appears to have unfolded largely in the 14th and 15th centuries, well before sustained European presence in the interior. Cahokia, the great city near modern St. Louis, was gone as a functioning center by around 1400, emptied by forces that had nothing to do with Europe, who would not arrive for another century and more. Across the mid-continent, other Mississippian centers followed similar arcs, rising and then falling in the centuries before contact. Stand in one of these river valleys and try to see the two pictures at once. The mounds, rising from the floodplain, evidence of thousands of people, of towns, of ceremony and labor and life, and the silence around them, settling in generations before any European set foot in the region. So, the mainstream understanding of Native American depopulation is not a single event but a layered one, and the layers matter. The overwhelming demographic catastrophe, the loss of a large fraction of the entire hemisphere's population, is firmly tied to European contact, and above all, to introduced disease. Smallpox, measles, influenza, and others, striking populations with no acquired immunity, often running ahead of the Europeans themselves through native trade networks, so that epidemics could devastate communities that had never seen a European face. This is well established, and its scale was staggering. On this, historians broadly agree, but layered beneath that later catastrophe, in certain regions, is an earlier and separate decline. A pre-contact reorganization that had already emptied some landscapes and thinned others before disease and colonization arrived to complete the transformation. The two are distinct processes, and conflating them, treating all the emptiness as the work of the Europeans, obscures something the evidence is trying to tell us. What then drove the earlier decline? Here, interpretations diverge, and researchers continue to debate them. Climate is the explanation with the firmest footing. The centuries in question coincide with the onset of the Little Ice Age, a period of cooling and increased climatic instability across the northern hemisphere beginning around 1300. For societies built on corn agriculture, as the Mississippian world was, cooler temperatures, shorter growing seasons, and more erratic rainfall could steadily undermine the agricultural surplus on which everything else depended. There is also evidence of severe, prolonged droughts in parts of the mid-continent during this era, recorded in tree rings and lake sediments. A farming society stressed year after year by failing harvests does not always collapse dramatically. Sometimes it simply disperses, families and communities drifting away toward better land until the center empties. The available evidence suggests climate was a genuine and powerful pressure. But most researchers are careful not to make it the sole cause, because the pattern is too complex for a single explanation. Consider what else was in play. The Mississippian chiefdoms were, as we have seen, inherently unstable, prone to cycles of consolidation and collapse, to warfare between rival centers, to the fracturing of authority. The archaeological record of the late Mississippian period shows increasing conflict, defensive palisades, fortified towns, evidence of violence. A region caught between failing harvests and rising warfare could become, over a few generations, a place people chose to leave. Some scholars point to the exhaustion of local resources after centuries of dense settlement, depleted soils, overhunted game, deforested surroundings. Others emphasize the internal logic of these societies, their tendency to come apart under stress and reform elsewhere. The most persuasive reading braids these together: a convergence of climatic downturn, agricultural stress, chronic warfare, and the structural fragility of the chiefdoms themselves, combining in different mixtures in different places to drive people out of the old centers and into new arrangements across the land. Because, and this is the essential point, the people did not vanish. They moved. The emptying of a region is not the disappearance of a population. Communities that left the vacant quarter appear to have relocated, coalescing into new groups elsewhere, joining or forming the societies that would eventually become the historic native nations of the Southeast and beyond. Depopulation of a place is not extinction of a people. It is migration, reorganization, the remaking of a human landscape, visible to archaeology as absence, but lived by those who experienced it as movement toward somewhere else. There is a further and more troubling possibility that deserves careful mention, precisely because it is so easy to overstate. Some researchers have asked whether Old World diseases might have reached parts of the interior even earlier than we assume, carried inland from early coastal contacts, from the Caribbean, or from the fringes of the Spanish expeditions, running ahead along native trade routes faster than any European traveled. If so, some pre-contact depopulation might, in truth, be very early post-contact depopulation. Its European cause simply invisible, because no European was present to record it. This is a genuine and actively debated question, but the evidence for it in the earliest cases is thin and contested, and it should be held as a possibility under investigation, not asserted as fact. For the clearest cases, Cahokia's decline, the emptying of the vacant quarter in the 1300s and 1400s, the timing runs too early even for this, and points to causes that were already at work well before the first sail appeared on the horizon. What we can say with confidence is narrow but real. Some regions of North America emptied before European contact. The clearest of these emptyings align with a period of climatic stress and social instability, not with the arrival of Europeans. And the later, vastly larger catastrophe of disease and colonization fell upon a continent that was, in places, already in the midst of its own transformations, so that the world the Europeans described was not the timeless, static Native America of the popular imagination, but a landscape already shaped by movement, loss, and renewal long before they came to see it. This matters for how we understand everything that followed. The first European accounts of the interior are often taken as a baseline, a snapshot of Native America as it was. But they were nothing of the kind. They were a snapshot of a world already in motion, some of its regions long emptied, others freshly devastated by diseases that had outrun the men who carried them. The explorers mistook a moment in a long, turbulent history for the whole of it. And that mistake has echoed through the centuries since, in the persistent and false image of a continent that was empty, or unchanging, or waiting. The mounds stand over the old river valleys still, in the quiet of the vacant quarter, marking where the towns once were. They were raised by people who read the sky and the seasons, who built and gathered and believed, and who, when the world turned against them, made the hard and human choice to go. We can measure the silence they left behind. We can trace, dimly, the pressures that moved them. What we cannot fully recover is the experience of that leaving. The last season in a dying town, the decision to carry what could be carried and walk toward an uncertain elsewhere. The land remembers only the absence. The rest went with them, down the long roads out of the quarter that would, ever after, be called vacant, a word that describes what the newcomers found and hides everything about what had truly happened there. Outro. We began with the earth, and we return to it now. Everything in this story was written into the ground. The mounds rising over the Mississippi floodplain, the serpent coiled along its Ohio ridge, the dead straight roads pointing north out of Chaco toward the pole of the turning sky. The cliff cities left with the pots still resting on their ledges. The canals threading water across the desert. The animal shapes laid into the grass of the north. The marks cut and painted onto stone from one coast to the other. A continent shaped by hand, across thousands of years, by people who watched the sky more closely than we do and moved more earth than we can easily imagine. And running through all of it, the same quiet refusal. They did not vanish. That was the story the newcomers told, of a land found empty, of mounds too fine to have been built by the people who lived beside them, of civilizations that dissolved into the air. It was a convenient story, and it was false. The builders of Cahokia and Etowah, the engineers of the Hohokam canals, the astronomers of Chaco and Newark, the makers of the effigy mounds and the rock art and the ancient copper, their descendants are here. They are the Pueblo and the O'odham, the Ho-Chunk and the Muskogee, the nations of the river valleys and the deserts and the northern lakes. What ended, again and again, was not a people but a way of living together, a particular answer to the oldest question of how human beings might share a place, a belief, a world. The mysteries we walked through were never really about disappearance. They were about transformation, and about the limits of what the evidence can tell us. We can measure the mounds and date the charcoal. We can trace the macaw bones and the copper bells along roads that ran deep into Mexico. We can calculate the angle of the solstice light and confirm, with our instruments, alignments the builders fixed 1,000 years ago. We have learned a great deal, and we are learning still. But at the edge of every site, the same honesty waits. We do not know his name, the man on the bed of shell beads. We do not know what the armless figures on the canyon wall were meant to be. We do not know, fully, why the great cities emptied, or what it felt like to walk out of them for the last time. Some of that silence is natural, the ordinary erosion of time. But some of it was made. The broken chains of memory, the suppressed languages, the deliberate severing of the lines along which this knowledge traveled. What survives came through fire to reach us, and where it survives, in the tradition still spoken, in the wave remembered across 3 centuries and confirmed by scribes on the far side of an ocean, it deserves to be listened to, not as decoration, but as testimony. So we are left, in the end, where the best of these stories leave us, standing on the shaped earth, looking at what remarkable people left behind, holding what we know beside what we may never recover, and letting both be true. The land remembers in its way, the people remember in theirs. And between the two lies everything we have spent this journey trying, carefully and humbly, to read. The mounds are still there, the roads still point north, the birds still fly, low in the grass above the river. They were here, they are here still, and they are still, patiently, waiting for us to understand.